The cerebral hemispheres are the largest part of the brain. They are separated by a deep midline sagittal fissure, the longitudinal cerebral fissure. The fissure contains the sickle-shaped fold of dura mater, the falx cerebri, and the anterior cerebral arteries. In the depth of the fissure, the corpus callosum is seen connecting the hemispheres across the midline. A second horizontal fold of dura mater separates the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum and is called the tentorium cerebelli. To increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex, the surface of each cerebral hemisphere is thrown into folds or gyri, which are separated by fissures or sulci. For ease of description, each hemisphere is divided into lobes according to the cranial bones underlying them. They are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital one. The central sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes. It is of great importance because it lies between the primarily motor and somatosensory areas, the precentral and postcentral gyri, respectively. The central sulcus runs downward and forward across the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. There it meets the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is a deep cleft found between the frontal and the temporal lobes. It begins as a short stem and divides caudally into three rami: the anterior horizontal ramus, anterior ascending ramus, and the posterior ramus. An area of cortex called the insula lies at the bottom of the deep lateral sulcus and may be observed only when the lips of the sulcus are separated. Here it is. The parieto-occipital sulcus begins on the superior medial margin of the hemisphere, about 5 cm anterior to the occipital pole, and separates the occipital and parietal lobes. It passes downward and anteriorly on the medial surface to meet the calcarine sulcus. The last one is found on the medial surface of the hemisphere. Here it is. The calcarine sulcus is joined at an acute angle by the parieto-occipital sulcus about halfway along its length. The frontal lobe is divided by 3 sulci into 4 gyri. The precentral sulcus runs parallel to the central sulcus, and the precentral gyrus lies between them. Extending anteriorly from the precentral sulcus are the superior and inferior frontal sulci. We divide the frontal lobe into the superior, medial, and inferior frontal gyri. The inferior frontal gyrus is invaded by the anterior and ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. The lateral surface of the parietal lobe is divided by 2 sulci into 3 gyri. The postcentral sulcus runs parallel to the central sulcus, and the postcentral gyrus lies between them. Running posteriorly from the middle of the postcentral sulcus is the intraparietal sulcus. Superior to the intraparietal sulcus is the superior parietal lobule or gyrus, and inferior to it is the inferior parietal lobule. The temporal lobe is divided into 3 gyri by 2 sulci, the superior and middle temporal sulci. They run parallel to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and divide the temporal lobe into the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. The inferior temporal gyrus is continued under the inferior surface of the hemisphere. The occipital lobe occupies the small area behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. On the mid-sagittal section of the brain, there are many important areas that should be recognized. First of all, the corpus callosum, which has the rostrum, genu, body, and splenium. The cingulate gyrus, which begins beneath the anterior end of the corpus callosum and continues above the corpus callosum until it reaches its posterior end. Here it is. This gyrus is separated from the corpus callosum by the callosal sulcus and from the superior frontal gyrus by the cingulate sulcus. The paracentral lobule is the area of the cerebral cortex that surrounds the continuation of the central sulcus to the medial superior border of hemisphere. The anterior part of this lobule is a continuation of precentral gyrus on the superior lateral surface, and the posterior part of the lobule is a continuation of the posterior gyrus. The precuneus is an area of cortex bounded anteriorly by the upturned posterior end of the cingulate sulcus and posteriorly by the parieto-occipital sulcus. The cuneus is a triangular area of cortex bounded above by the parieto-occipital sulcus, inferiorly by the calcarine sulcus, and posteriorly by the superior medial margin. The collateral sulcus is situated on the inferior surface of the hemisphere. This runs anteriorly below the calcarine sulcus. Between the collateral sulcus and the calcarine sulcus is the lingual gyrus. Anterior to the lingual gyrus is the para-hippocampal gyrus, which terminates in front as the hook-like uncus. The medial occipitotemporal gyrus extends from the occipital pole to the temporal pole. It is bounded medially by the collateral and renal sulci, and laterally by the occipitotemporal sulcus. The occipitotemporal gyrus lies lateral to the sulcus and is continuous with the inferior temporal gyrus. On the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, the olfactory bulb and tract overlie the olfactory sulcus. Medial to the olfactory sulcus is the gyrus rectus, and lateral to the sulcus are the number of orbital gyri. And let's review the structures you must be able to recognize. Cerebral hemisphere, longitudinal cerebral fissure, falx cerebri, corpus callosum, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, central sulcus, precentral sulcus, postcentral sulcus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus, superior, medial, and inferior frontal gyri, lateral sulcus, anterior horizontal ramus, anterior ascending ramus, posterior ramus, insula, superior temporal sulcus, middle temporal sulcus, superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri, parieto-occipital sulcus, calcarine sulcus, cuneus, precuneus, collateral sulcus, renal sulcus, lingual gyrus, para-hippocampal gyrus, uncus, medial occipitotemporal gyrus, olfactory sulcus, gyrus rectus, orbital gyri, corpus callosum, rostrum, genu, body, and splenium of corpus callosum, cingulate gyrus, callosal sulcus, cingulate sulcus, paracentral lobule.